to flow. Hello, everyone, and welcome to hour 24 of the CosmoQuest Hangout-a-Thon. We are bringing you science, scientists, games, art, more, and you're getting to meet our team, our volunteers, and everyone else. Now, one of the great things that we're getting to do during this event is we're interviewing scientists and researchers who are doing things that are near and dear to our heart. And right now, please forgive me if I mispronounce your last name. We are joined by Dr. Natalie Trevino. She is at Open University in London. She works on space ethics. She is a researcher and educator and an expert on decolonizing space. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you.
I'm being told my volume is low. One moment while I check to make sure we don't have... I'm on the wrong mic. All right, this is a fixable problem. All right, I am now on the correct mic for the audience. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us. This is the second panel along these lines that we've had during the event. Yesterday we talked with Thelina. I'm going to say his last name wrong. I've known him so many years. I shouldn't do this. Heleninga. I know I said it totally wrong. Thelina. He goes by Thelina a lot. He is on the faculty at the Earth Life Science Institute in Japan, and also is a researcher on decolonizing space. And we talked about how to plan our Mars base in a way that is respectful to everyone involved and remembers to include the locals whenever there are locals and research is being done. Now, your research focuses are a bit different, and I want you here, and I'm so grateful you were able to join, because you can help us understand why the concept of decolonizing space is so hard and so very necessary. And I'd like to start out by asking you to just explain what the concept of decolonizing space science is.
So it is very hard.
Yeah.
I think that's why it scares a lot of people to kind of bring up words that aren't necessarily normally in science, especially science education. People are like, wait a second, colonization ended, and we don't have to worry about these things anymore. What does it have to do with space? Oftentimes, or the very age-old notion, well, there aren't any Indians in outer space, so it doesn't matter what we do. Which I feel as though if I had a nickel for every time someone said that to me,
Really?
oh, it would be incredible. I could feed my cats for years. So when it comes to decolonizing space, I think there's a couple things we need to keep in mind. One, that decolonizing space really actually begins on Earth. It's Earth's work. It starts here, and it's really about what we take with us and how we decide to go into space. And it is more about thinking about how we want to live as people in the future, in space, on the moon, on Mars, wherever it might be, and thinking, okay, what do I have to do right now to make sure that that future comes about? Oftentimes, that isn't amazing science, glamorous space work. It's often, contacting, if you're in the United States, your representative or congressman sometimes. Sometimes it's, going to a protest. Sometimes it is, arguing with your uncle in Thanksgiving. And we all know those sorts of actions, and they seem so detached from space. But what it's actually doing is it's producing an experience of and a value of who it is that you want to be and how it is that you want to be in the world. And that will go into space with us, because everything in space is something we're going to take.
Now, I have heard throughout my career various examples given of why this is important. There is always the story of the classroom where they always talked about manned space flight. And when you ask the kids who wants to be an astronaut, none of the girls held up their hands.
Right.
But when we changed the language to human space flight, we were able to have more people see themselves traveling to space.
Yeah.
Thelina on Friday gave the example of researchers that went to Sri Lanka on tourist visas, collected samples, and wrote research papers without including any of the Sri Lankan researchers who didn't have the resources to do what these people did on a whim on vacation. What are all the different things that add up to make this so necessary?
A lot of it comes down to thinking about how it is that we as individuals want to exist in this world and to understand our positions. So a lot of times, we do have examples of scientists going and being like, oh, I can go do this research. Well, that's great, but not everybody can do that. And oftentimes the work that's being done isn't done in a way that the university system considers it acceptable, science considers it acceptable, and we have to kind of rethink what those standards are and who they include and who they don't. Very prominently, we know that there was a lot of really incredible mathematics and physics out of pre-colonial Mexico, or what we would consider Mexico in Latin America, a physics that we don't understand, we don't know, because back then they just kind of destroyed it, and anything that was left was considered folk.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden we have all this science, and what ends up becoming like indigenous knowledge, where scientists figured out, and then all of a sudden the indigenous people are, well, yeah, we know, and because it was never considered science in the sense of the university or the sense of science, it's considered thrown out or just folk. And so we're dealing with a lot of different layers of what is actual research, what is science, what is the way of going about understanding or exploring the universe, and who's traditionally got access to that versus who has had their knowledge actually destroyed as a way of subduing an entire nation or civilization in some cases. Sorry, go ahead.
and it's often as simple as the names we use for the stars. One of the things that greatly amuses me is anywhere in the world that they can see the constellation that in Western society I've learned is Scorpius. It is a scorpion if there are scorpions where they are. So this means that people in extreme north and south, where it's too cold for scorpions, don't acknowledge it. They also don't see the whole constellation. But like the whole middle part of the planet, north and south, that's a scorpion. Mm-hmm. But we just use the name Scorpius. And there are so many nations with so many different ideas of the zodiacal constellations that wrap around the equator, so many different names, and we see evidence of how the Arabic world preserved knowledge in the names of stars.
Yes.
But we have lost so many of the other traditions and ideas through what we teach in school.
Yeah.
How do we change that?
Oh, that's where it gets difficult, but also it's quite easy because you can actually take the knowledge that's directly there when, you're teaching, especially when you're teaching astronomy and you're giving actual names of stars, and all of a sudden they are Arabic.
Uh-huh.
And then of course, traditionally and as an American, in the Western education system, it kind of is this weird, the creation of the world, depending on how you want to see it, Babylon, Greek, Roman, and in that flow, where there's an entire section of history where it's actually the Islamic world and the Arabic world that's actually preserving all of the knowledge. Well, Europe is kind of figuring out what it's doing and what we traditionally have called the Dark Ages, but it's kind of a more complex period. And then all of a sudden, we come into our modern curriculum where none of that's actually mentioned.
Right.
We just kind of get the Greek to Rome to medieval to the creation of the U.S. and the nation state and kind of move from there. And then when you're teaching something like astronomy, that's in a perfect moment to say, actually, look at this entire history
Yeah.
that we've just kind of discarded, because in any given time, the good guys and the bad guys change, and what becomes relevant changes. And that's actually specific to the socio-cultural and political situation at the time, and has nothing to do with the actual history of the world. And those are really great moments to interject, to disrupt,
Yes.
and to bring in a lot of work that's been done around the world to say, we don't always know, but these people kind of had a theory, and it's not who you might think it is. And that's those moments where you kind of have to take advantage of not ambiguity, but really those moments where the world kind of is expansive, and you can't always explain it away by just being like, well, the Arabs named that star. Well, they sure heck named a lot of stars, you know. And why did they do it? It was systematic. It wasn't, offhand. And we have that opportunity to kind of go in there and explain that. And that's like really one of the ways you can do it, because I think education is essential
Yes.
for changing hearts and minds, because it's that moment where you get to be uncertain and explore and then move forward.
And and sometimes it's as simple as teaching someone geography. And this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's true. Throughout almost every single astronomy textbook, there are these stories of Ptolemy, Aristarchus, and these are all very Greek sounding names because that's how they got written down. But the parts of the world that they were in when they were doing their work, the Ptolemy dynasty was in Egypt.
Right.
When we were figuring out the size of the planet by looking at shadows in wells, that was in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And we just, folks mostly, I hope, kind of, sort of, maybe know where Alexandria was.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of these other places, if we could just look at a map at where the science was done, it feels like we could enable change.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting because that's why, and oftentimes we consider them the softer sciences
Yeah.
or the social sciences, and bringing those things in to say, this science that you're learning, here's where it is on a map. Why is it there? And I think a great example, bringing up Alexandria, like the Library of Alexandria was in Alexandria, that wasn't in the middle of France or in Washington, D.C., or, any of the places that we might conceptualize. I was in Africa. And that in itself, just saying that, really oftentimes brings students to go, wait a second.
Yeah.
For the last 100 years, we've been like, oh, poor Africa. Maybe it wasn't always that way.
Right.
And how did it get that way? And how can we really reshape our understanding of the world through that?
And a lot of what decolonizing space entails is showing the diversity that has always existed, showing the history that has been lost through colonialization, and allowing people to see themselves and their own history in today's world. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things I'm really loving is there's a modern movement within the International Astronomical Union to, when new worlds are found, name them after the gods and traditions of the peoples where the telescopes are located. Because we stick telescopes in weird places on this planet. And this leads folks like me who do not understand phonics struggling. But it changes the stories we tell. What are your favorite examples of ways that we are trying to change things?
I think naming is a really good example. So I'm Midwestern. Our tongues are not created for most languages.
I'm coming to you from the St. Louis area.
Yeah, we can say tater tot. We don't get a lot. And I think really challenging the very vocabulary of our world. I like to use the examples of the ways in which oftentimes knowledge, and this might be it sounds sad, but the ways in which knowledge gets destroyed
Yes.
and then rediscovered.
Yeah.
So, and oftentimes we have lots of knowledge about medical science, or what we now consider medical science, to come from midwives who were deemed witches in Europe in the medieval period.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they held a lot of power because they were knowledgeable, and the church was like, well, just get rid of that. And all of a sudden, there's a political reason to get rid of these people who hold all of this knowledge. And then modern medical science, as we understand, especially when it comes around to pregnancy and birth, doesn't actually start to gain any kind of sophistication until the 20th century. And even then, we're still kind of dealing with the repercussions.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, now with modern birthing practices, we're actually just going back to what we already knew, or what's folk knowledge, or very taboo knowledge.
Yes.
And so that's a really good example of the ways in which these things aren't linear. It's not progress where we don't know and then we do know. It is, we kind of know something. What are the actual socio-political circumstances under which this knowledge is obtained? Does it fit to the context of the people in power? Oh, no? Okay, then we don't want it. And then kind of going back. So there's a lot of stuff that's being rediscovered rather than discovered.
Yes.
And that's where having a full historical account of the world as we know it is really important, because then you get to actually say, wait a second, science isn't just done in this vacuum. Science is done in the world, and that makes it messy. And that actually makes it really hard. Because if you were to say, and bringing telescopes into it, where did this knowledge come from? If we look at the telescopes and the controversy around telescopes in certain places, why is it there? Who actually was disadvantaged? Who actually gets to have this knowledge? And when we're saying, especially in if we can bring in Mauna Kea to talk about the telescope or the potentiality of telescopes in Hawaii, who gets to benefit as all humankind from these telescopes? If it's on land that's been stolen, that disregards an entire group of people. And really, at the end of the day, if we're going to say space is for all humankind, then that actually has to start now, not at some point in the future where it becomes space is for all humankind. When we get to Mars, we get to the moon, or we do this other things, space should be for all humankind right here, right now.
And the building of telescopes, I think, is something very important to address. A number of years ago, I was at an International Astronomical Union meeting, and this was when they were still debating where the square kilometer array was going to be built. It was after the construction of the South African Large Telescope, which at the time was one of the largest in the world. And one of the gentlemen in the room, a South African black who remembered apartheid, he stood up and he said that in his country, people often argue that there's so much that needs to be changed. Why are we bothering with astronomy? And what he pointed out was the amount of money spent on astronomy for all of South Africa wouldn't quite buy lunch for everyone in South Africa for one day. But at the same time, when they put these observatories in remote locations, they're bringing high-speed internet, they're bringing electricity, they're bringing plumbing, they're building jobs to places that are otherwise under-resourced. So for South Africa, and we see the same thing to a certain degree in the Canary Islands, there are observatories in Morocco. These are places, Chile is another, where they are leveraging the building of observatories as a reason to put in infrastructure and create jobs in a high-tech world that otherwise couldn't exist.
Right.
Now, these are places that say, we want this to advance. But on the other side, there is a terrible tradition, particularly here in the United States, of putting observatories on indigenous lands. And this is particularly problematic because so many of the people who were originally there saw mountaintop spaces as sacred spaces. So we see Kitt Peak in Arizona is in the middle of a reservation. We see Mauna Kea, Haleakala in Hawaii. And this led to a problem with the 30-meter telescope. And I think you're probably better positioned to introduce what happened than I am there.
So with the 30 millimeter, what? I always say it wrong. 30-meter telescope, it's really quite complex, because when we actually talk about, the idea of telescopes and observatories bringing in infrastructure for places that don't have it, a lot of times they're underdeveloped places intentionally through colonialism.
Yeah.
Right? These places were not just desolate who, need something. They were made in this way to create a wasteland for such development that would then, be for the benefit of oftentimes the colonial governments. And so we can't start the history of a place with the tendency to want to, like when we're building something, especially in the context of Hawaii, where there is a massive resistance to colonialism on the part of the United States. It exists today. It exists since the moment that they encountered Europeans, and that's why they often celebrate the death of James Cook in a way that many people are quite uncomfortable with, but it is a moment of liberation for them rather than a moment of sadness on the part of a person dying.
Yeah, and this unlike many other places was an already advanced culture that
Yes.
had newspapers, radio stations.
Yes.
It was as advanced as anything else between Japan and America. It was the stopping point.
Yeah.
There was culture.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And oftentimes when you look at the history of those places, oftentimes it's shaped like, oh, we're saving people, we're doing this. It's absolutely not in that case. And you could say that about most colonized places. They had a lot of sophistication that just gets disregarded. And so in the case of Mauna Kea, we're looking at a mountaintop that's not just sacred, but in allowing the desecration of this place, Hawaiian sovereignty is being trampled yet again.
Yes.
So there's the sacredness and the sovereign capacities that have to be taken in. So it's a political movement just as much as it is a religious one. And so to reject a telescope isn't rejecting astronomy, because Hawaiians have a massive tradition and great advancements in astronomy and astronomical work. It is rejecting the very construct of what other places should be able to do in Hawaii. And then also just completely disregarding the fact that, well, okay, if we're going to put this thing in Hawaii, well, are Hawaiian astronomers going to have access to it? Or is it Hawaiian astronomy going to be done? No, it's going to be done for the purposes of someone else, somewhere else, to the advantage of someone else. And that's where it kind of starts to reify. Well, I'm not going to say that word. It's a terrible word. It reconforms to the legacy of colonialism, because it completely disregards the population at the exact same time where everyone's saying this is for humankind.
And let's put some specifics on that. So with the Mauna Kea Observatory for a long time, they've had amazing astronomy outreach programs, and some of them do employ Indigenous peoples and reach out to Indigenous schools that are even Hawaiian language schools. But the majority of them reach out to the schools near the observatory where all of the observatory's kids are attending. And so we're doing a lot of astronomy outreach to people who are not culturally native to the island and genetically native to the island. And so all of the good that folks are saying is being done to the wrong audience, where last time I checked, there had only been one PhD in astronomy granted from the University of Hawaii to a Hawaiian native. Mm-hmm. And And the other side of that was there were also very sophisticated treaties written that designated things like only a certain number of telescopes could be built in the crater of Mauna Kea. And as convenient, astronomers have redefined what it means for something to be a telescope.
Yes, of course.
Keck, two massive mirrors, that's one telescope that works together. Radio arrays of multiple telescopes, that's one telescope. And so you get to this point where the treaties even say folks have to always be granted access to the land for spiritual purposes, but then when they're doing construction, that doesn't count.
Right. There's always a way around it. That's really what becomes a problem. And oftentimes, I joke oftentimes that settler math with treaties is very similar to like siblings.
I have never heard that phrase.
When like you're cutting cake,
yeah,
you're like, well, this one's for me and this one's for my younger sister, and it's basically even.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna make sure I always cut it.
Right.
That's really how you can think about it. And if it were to actually be equal, it would be like, who does the cake actually belong to? Who baked the cake? Yeah. Why are we having this cake? What's going on? And it's not that telescopes would never be built in certain places. It's just that things would be not a little bit. They would be a lot different.
Yeah.
In how these things are administered, who actually benefits from what's going on. Oftentimes you hear about construction being done, and it's never thinking about the sustainability or the integration into the environment or the ecosystem, or how that's actually going to integrate with the culture of a place. It's always, we're going to build this thing, and you know what, we'll recycle, so it's going to be okay. And there's more to it than that often gets overlooked, and whether or not that's because and oftentimes it's not because someone's being intentionally colonial or racist or this. It's just the best practice of the business or the standard practice of the university or the standard practice of the institution. And that's where it kind of goes, well, there's nothing we can do because this is just how things are done. And that's why really decolonized space is about, well, then the institution needs to change. That can only happen by individuals in the institution demanding change. And so that's where it kind of always is rolling back and saying, we are either complicit in this or we're not. And if we're not, then what do we do?
And one of the things that looking up the context of your education and your research that really got me is, so you're a Midwesterner. You went to Western University in London, Ontario, in Canada. You've studied space ethics. You now find yourself based in London. You were someone who has escaped your own culture and traveled the world. And I have to ask, how has that affected your worldview?
To be very, very honest, it has made me sometimes I get really sad about space. I can't deny that. Like sometimes I'll be in situations where I love space. Mm-hmm. I love space exploration. There is nothing more than I want a human presence on the moon and a beautiful lunar civilization. And really, I want a cat ranch on the moon. I think cats in a spacesuit would be super cute. But that's just me. And there'll be times where I'm sitting in talking with discussions or talking with policymakers or industry people or even other, space researchers. And it's just so much of the same. Well, we're going to build an industry. We'll mine the moon. We'll extract everything that we can from it. And then we'll go to another place. That's the most boring idea I've ever heard for space. And that really affects me in a lot of ways. And I think back to, I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, Michigan. I had beautiful skies all the time. I had beautiful access to the moon. But we were really poor, I thought, I want more than this. I want to know the world. And so then when I hear people who are interested in space and they say, well, we can go and we can mine the moon. Well, I don't love the moon because I think of like what I can get from it. I just like the experience of being conscious of the universe. And then going and seeing other places and talking with other people in different cultures, what's actually universal about being human isn't the things we have in common. And, we all get leg cramps when we run too much, or, nobody actually likes Brussels sprouts, but we're all pretending we do. Those aren't the universal. Well, they can be, but the universals are actually, there's something up there that we all really love. No one's like, oh, I hate space. I've never met a person in the entire world who's like, ooh, the moon? Why are you interested in that? It's like dinosaurs. Nobody hates dinosaurs.
Correct.
There are actually two universals, space and dinosaurs. That's it. And one of the things that actually really gives me hope is that every single culture on the face of this planet has a relationship to the sky and to space. And we all think that there's something worth like exploring and understanding and being part of. And that's absolutely beautiful. And it goes beyond wanting to mine the moon or geopolitics or power or any of the things that we've had to deal with over the last, 100 years of space exploration, whether or not it's the US or the Russians or whoever, all those things. Every single person goes, yeah, we're part of this. And that to me is so reassuring at the same time that I'm in these rooms where people are like, well, once we get this mineral from space, we can sell it for this price and we can do this thing. And you know what? Once we get that, the stakeholders will be happy. Have you ever looked at the moon?
Yeah. So one of the harder factors in current space exploration is we are moving from a time where space was explored by rich nations to a time when space is explored by rich men. Mm-hmm. This is very much the West India Trading Company that we had once upon a time, trying to get spices and goods between all the different continents.
Yes.
So, as AstroWise puts it in the chat, save me from the neoliberal venture capitalists.
Me too.
So we have all these companies, Astroforge, I think, being one of the latest, and the first one planning to get something on an asteroid to use its resources. We have all these companies looking to go take advantage of space rocks. We have all these companies looking to take over our sky with satellites and threaten us with the Kessler syndrome. In a society where folks like me want to give everything away for free and then have to figure out how to pay our bills,
yes,
but the majority of society is driven by capitalism. How do we actually institute change when capitalism is the driving motivation?
Yeah, that's where it goes beyond space.
Yeah.
And I'm actually in the process of writing a piece that should be published next year where I refer to it as love starts somewhere. And for me, it's my love of the moon.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I'm willing to do anything to go to the moon, willing to do anything to colonize the moon, willing to do anything to get my camp ranch on the moon. It means that I love the moon for what it is. And if it means that I have to do work here to get that done, then that's where it is. And so when it comes down to, capitalism is all inclusive right now. We all have to pay our rent. We all have to do all these things. We all have to fight with our gas companies every once in a while. Those are the realities of our world. That's not forever. And so that's where activism comes in. It's where community organizing comes in. It's where, to say, I have a love for space, so I actually want my neighbors to be well fed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want the schools to actually be educating in an equitous way. I want the shores on the sea to be clean. I want these sorts of things. And that's where it actually starts. So it's a matter of organizing in a way to kind of make sure, and depending on where you are in the political spectrum, we could say, oh, we need revolution. Yeah, great idea. It's still really hard to get there. And it definitely starts by, loving your neighbor and taking care of them. And that's where we have to start. So what can you do in your local community? How can you help? What is the gift that you have to give? oftentimes we think, well, I don't have anything to do, like I'm not good at anything. We're all good at something, and that's what we have to give. And that's where it starts. I think also being very vocal about the fact that we don't want, Elon Musk controlling a colony on Mars, because it will not look good. It will not be good. It will not. These are not the things we want. And saying, you know what? No, that's not my vision of the future.
And let's go back to specifics, because
Yeah.
this is something I read at one point, some of what Elon Musk was talking about in terms of how would they run and support a colony on Mars. And it was very much the company town idea where
Yeah. Oh,
you... So go ahead, explain the specifics, please.
So it is very much not just a company town. It is literally the entire indentured servants going to the new world,
Yes,
on a boat pattern, where you're saying, oh, well, everyone who wants to go to Mars can pay for it. Those who can't pay for it can work it off. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah.
And how did that work? What did that look like? And then once you're on Mars, well, everything will be based on the company town. So whatever the actual manufacturing or whatever the jobs are, that will actually, the company will own it. And then you buy things from the company, you rent from the company, and you kind of live in this company-based, city. And all of the rules are made by the company. And we've had those experiences before across the world.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is massive exploitation of workers, massive amounts of abuse. And of course, then you can get reinforcements of sexism and racism and all sorts of forms of oppression, based purely on the fact that a single company is in charge and their motivation is profit. It isn't the wellness and the well-being and the maintenance of the community. And that is terrifying, to think that this was the past, and now we think this is a great idea for the future. Well, just because we got here right now, because we've done this, doesn't mean that it was a good way of doing it, because of all the people who have been hurt and damaged, and the amount of trauma that have, been through the generations of people having to contend with this, and so when we're really specifically talking about what a city on Mars could look like under the control of private capital, it is terrifying, because just imagine you're $10 short on your air bill that month. What happens? And that, to alleviate that from happening, is the work that needs to be done now. And that is organizing, that is, sometimes it is talking back to people, sometimes it is marching in the streets, and sometimes it is, donating and being part of an organization where it's like, we're actually going to educate, free schools and free meals and do what we can. And always knowing that everything you're doing is not just for the here and now, it's also for the future. And hopefully that future is in space, because just imagine how much more as humans we're going to be able to understand and access and get, and experience in that realm.
Right. I desperately want a future that includes fossil hunting on Mars by researchers.
Yeah.
Now, you have shaped a career in space ethics. And when I started university, that was not a thing. Like my original career goal was to go into space policy. I was in a program at Michigan State University. I took economics. I decided, no, I'm just going to get a science degree because I don't actually want to understand any more economics. But I might have continued on the space policy path if there was a way to do it that was ethics focused instead of law and economics. What is the history of getting space ethics started, and how do we get it into more programs?
Well, as someone who also studied space policy, I initially wanted to go into lobbying, and then I took one lobbying course, and I was like,
yeah,
oh no. And also, I just have to shout out to Michigan State, because my sister went there. Go Spartans. It's ethics, I think, oftentimes the last thing considered, especially when it
Yes.
comes to science and technology. Oh, we can do this thing. Should we do this thing? And because oftentimes behind the science is someone funding it because they think that it will actually lead to profit in the future, the ethics of something is kind of like, oh, well, it's I'm not trying to do anything bad, therefore it's not bad. Space ethics actually started along with space science, but it was never particularly popular because it was always the dissenting voice in the room. And the type of space ethics that I do actually started in the 1960s and 70s, where it's saying, hey, we actually need to think about the socio-political aspects of these things. And for everyone who is watching, who might watch in the future, go do yourself a favor and look up Whitey on the Moon. But it's an absolutely fantastic poem about why is it that we can afford to go to the moon, but we can't afford, healthcare. And oddly enough, it's still relevant.
Yeah.
I think ethics scares people because it asks existential questions that aren't always on the forefront of someone's mind. Because if we ask, why are we going into space, and it's not economic, it's not political, well, then it might actually be something very philosophical. And oh no, what if the answer is no?
Yeah.
Why do I want to go into space? Do I want to go to space because I grew up and was fostered in a colonial civilization? Oh, no, like that, does that make my interests wrong? Well, no, because there's something more to it than that. And I think ethics asks the deeper questions that can be very scary, because it makes you change your behavior. It says, do I want to be part of this? I think if we had been asking ethical questions, things would go slower. If NASA were asking ethical questions in the 1950s, would they have hired von Braun?
No.
Right. If they had not hired von Braun, would we have gone to the moon? Oh, if we didn't go to the moon, would we have lost the space? We're looking at a massive redirection of the entire course of our history as we know it,
Yes.
based very much on what kind of human do you want to be?
It always makes me think of Dante's Meditations, where one of the concepts that he explores is how acting beyond understanding is a source of sin, because when you do things without fully understanding the repercussions, there is so much potential for things to go so terribly wrong, and you can't claim total ignorance.
Yes.
And I think that this idea that you need to pause and consider repercussions, as human beings, we don't do easily, but we need to.
Yes. And it's partially built into space exploration as an entire construction because it's really exciting.
Right, right.
You get to see these images and you're like, oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you want, what else? What else is out there? Let's do this. But it should also be in the moment that you're overwhelmed with awe, that we're literally educated into the ethics of the awe rather than the acceleration of it. I want it again. I want to feel it again. Well, what does this actually invoke? What's going on here, and how is it not just affecting me but everybody else?
Yes.
And that's where it is both a very human individual experience, but also something that institutions have a responsibility to teach.
Yeah. And it has the added layer of complexity in space science where we are very much funded through federal funds, state funds, donations, and doing something that offends the norms of whatever segment of society is controlling the purse strings
Yes.
can ruin your ability to continue doing research.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Yeah. It all comes down to ethics and realizing we don't live in a meritocracy where fairness is real. But we can
Right.
fight to make that real, and you seem very much to be determined to do that with the career you're setting yourself.
Yeah, it's funny because I often get accused of hating space exploration because I'm critical. I'm critical of this, or I'm critical of that. Like, hey,
That's a
I don't
form
know if the art of
that's a form of
it,
love.
it's exact. And I always say that I'm like, excuse me, the people writing, the 5,000 word essays on criticizing this one scene in Star Wars aren't doing it because they hate Star Wars. They're doing it because they love Star Wars, and there's this one
Yes.
continuality that just doesn't make sense. They're like, hey, wait a second. And you would only know that through love. You would only know it through paying absolute attention. And I think criticism has its plays,
Uh-huh.
but so does creativity. To saying, okay, you know what we're doing isn't working. What we're doing it doesn't make sense for the future. But what could it look like?
Right.
And that's the much more exciting part of the work. Because that's what everybody can. Oh, well, if it isn't, I'm $10 short on my air bill, I might die. What does the actual society on Mars look like? Oh, I don't, is it culturally expansive? Is it Star Trek? Is it Star Wars? Is it something we can't even imagine right now because the person who's going to construct it isn't born?
And
And that's where it gets so cool and exciting.
and yes, more of this, please. Now, I sadly need to start winding up this
Yeah.
amazing conversation. And so I want to end with, how can people follow you and learn more about what you're doing and be there when your paper comes out next year?
So on all of the socials, and I still need a blue sky code.
Oh,
So if anyone,
I got you. I got you.
great. Okay,
Yeah.
then I will be Nat Geo Theory in all socials all the time. I'm slightly active on Twitter, but more active on Instagram. And I have a website, nataliebtrevino.com, where I try to keep updated on all things of what I'm doing. And here's the secret: if you want to read my work, just email me. You don't have to buy it. I'll send you my stuff. And my email address is natalie.trevino@open.ac.uk. So it's much easier to do that, and no one wants to pay hyper expensive, publication fees.
Fair.
Why would we do that? Yeah. And I currently have a chapter out in the Routledge Handbook on the Social Studies of Outer Space, which I'm happy to give away. So that's where you can follow me and find me. And I'm always doing speaking tours. So, trying to get out there and doing as much as I can to make sure things are optimistic while also we criticize what's wrong with it.
This is amazing. I hope our paths cross in the real world, and we'll at least cross in blue sky, because I got you.
Amazing.
All
Thank you.
right.
Thank you.
So I am going to switch over now. I believe we have on the diagonal in Minecraft. Let's go see how our Mars research base is going. Thank you,
Awesome.
and good luck.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I'm here at the base of our lander rocket. This is the rocket that we reached our Mars build by. We go around here to the back. You can take a look inside the rocket. Normally you're not able to do this, but through the magic of creative Minecraft, we can go up and take a look at how little space was actually available in the rocket to start with. We brought some supplies and had a lot of equipment up here to control the flight and the landing places for the astronauts. Probably a little space down here